is in the middle of it all. Now, the reason I put in the middle of it all is because if you read the first 4 verses and the last verses, they're not really wonderful verses like these ones. It's kind of like some Psalms, they start out with a whole litany of complaints, but they end with praise. And some start out with praise and end with a litany of complaints. This one, the middle part, is all praise. There's a Christian man, Mr. Rogers, of the child's show of the same name. And it's thought of as all sunshine and roses, a wonderful show that gives kids wonderful things to talk about and think about. But it touched all the hard subjects of life. When the show started, segregation was part of the South. And Mr. Rogers had a black policeman come on, and the two of them took off their shoes and cooled their feet in the wading pool that was on the set of Mr. Rogers. He was tackling the hard subject of segregation. He tackled the subject of divorce and how that affected children, and death, and crime, and all the other subjects that a child would be impacted by. Well, if you read only the verses from 5 to 10, you would think that David only tackled the good times when everything was going right. But you'd be wrong, because like Mr. Rogers, he addressed it all. The start and finish of this psalm is all about bad people doing bad things. These psalms, there are psalms that are written where the writer of the psalm is yelling at God for failing him. And psalms where he's confessing that it all went wrong. In Psalm 40, it says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry, and brought me out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay. He set my feet upon a rock and made my footsteps firm. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many may see and fear and will trust in the Lord. And it continues, and you see, a pit of destruction is not a very good place to be in. Psalms are all headed all. Every human emotion is covered. But the key is they kept talking to God. It wasn't like, oh, my life is bad. That's it. God, you blew it. I'm gone. I'm out of here. The worst thing possible is talking to God, because where else can you go? The other thing is, it's almost universally that in the Psalms, there's a component of praise. Think of it as the writer is saying, it seems to me, everything points to the fact that you blew it. But I don't know everything, and maybe you didn't blow it. And so maybe it's just my limited knowledge of the situation. So I want to praise you for who you are and how you care. Think of the book of Psalms as one of these. It's a multi-tool. It's got every little, it can do all sorts of things. And the Psalms, you can read a psalm that's all about praise. It's the sun is shining, the birds are singing, it's wonderful today. And you can read a psalm where everything possible is going wrong. And you can read a psalm where somebody else has messed up so bad that they think there's no saving possible. But in the end it was. David wrote about Bathsheba and how he said, against you and you alone have I sinned and done this great evil. Well, we're going to look at the middle part where David had a lot of praise for God. But the first to the last part where it says, transgressions speak to the ungodly within his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for it flatters him in his own eyes concerning the discovery of his iniquity and the hatred of it. The words of his mouth are wickedness and deceit. He has ceased to be wise and to do good. He plans wickedness upon his bed and sets himself on a path that is not good. and does not despise evil. You can see from this that David is not in a place where everything is perfect. It's not all sunshine and roses for him. In spite of the fact that the middle of it, you would swear that it was. Well, let's look at the psalm. Number 1, deep and wide. Verse 5 and 6 says, "Your loving kindness, O Lord, extends to the heavens, and your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. O Lord, you preserve man and beast." Well, when we were children, or maybe when we were adults, and I don't remember when we were children, but we sang a song. Marilyn probably taught this song, Deep and Wide. And I always got this is the deep part, and this is the wide part, and I always got the reverse, but the kids didn't seem to care. Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. God's loving kindness and his salvation is for us. Well, think of these verses in Psalms as an adult version of this song. We think of David as a man's man and a warrior, the strongest man you could think of. He's the guy. He was in so many battles that God said, "You cannot build my temple because you're a man of war." There's a passage where it says he had the strength to pull back a bronze bow, which must have been a feat of exceptional strength, or he wouldn't have mentioned it. He was also proficient in every weapon of war. He went to the temple and they said, "You have a weapon?" And he said, "I have Goliath's sword." And he says, "That's great, I'll take that." He also was doing all these macho manly things, but still he wrote poetry full of raw feelings. He's also recognized that there was a limit to what language can do. At that time, there was no manned flight, so the heavens, the skies, were something beyond them. They had no idea just how far it went up. So it was David's way of saying, "Your loving kindness is beyond the farthest reaches of my understanding." That's the problem with human nature. Human language is it has limits. The Inuit have 40 words for snow. The Greek had 5 words for love. And neither one of them are enough. And in English, we have 1 word for each. 1 word for snow, 1 word for love. And so you can see how hard it is to express anything that's satisfactory and complete. And then you add to it, how are we going to, if we can't express the love we have for each other, or for our dog, or for anything, how are we going to express our love for God properly? Now, we know just the thought of sin is foreign to God. I was listening to Charles Stanley preaching about temptation, and the Bible says that God will not tempt us, even though sometimes we think that, well, God put that temptation in my way. No, he didn't. The Greek for that word, in that sentence where it says God will not tempt us, is translated, he's unfamiliar with it. What it says is, he doesn't know how. We say that God can do everything, but he can't. God can only do the things that are part of his nature, that are within his nature. And he can't tempt us to sin. He can love, though, and there's no limit to that, to his love, which is a problem for us because we don't know what that kind of love looks like. I guess the song Deep and Wide is as good as any attempt to explain God's love for us. Well, number 2 is more word pictures. Psalm 36, 7 and 8 said, "How precious is your loving kindness, O God, and the children of men take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They drink your fill in the abundance of your house, and you give them to drink of the rivers of your delights." Now, God's love is a hard concept to explain. It's not like wind, which we know what wind is. It's the moving of air on the earth. Or sunlight. It's the sun's rays striking the earth. Or gravity is the magnetic pull of the earth on objects close to it. These are phenomena that are universally accepted, that we know what that explanation is. That's not so with God's loving kindness. With it, you can say something, you have to say something to compare it to. What's God's love compared to? Because you can't explain it. David, in this verse, he compares it to refuge in the shadow of your wings. Now, mother birds can shelter their children, their chicks, under their wings. There's a story where there was a fire, and the fire swept through the farm, and they found this dead chicken, burnt to death. And they picked up the chicken, and the chicks were underneath their wings, and they survived. The problem, of course, is a mother can shelter the chicks under her wings, so that's an explanation that gives us an idea. But what about when her chicks become adults? What about when her chicks are adults and have chicks of their own? Well, the truth is that God can shelter every human being on the earth. And there's never a point where I can't get under the corner. I'm half of me's covered. It's like an umbrella. Two people sharing an umbrella, both people get one shoulder wet. Well, that's not true with God's loving kindness. He gives rain and sun and air to breathe for everyone on the entire earth. And this verse that says, "You give us to drink of the rivers of your delight." Now, suppose after the service, I drove to Campbellton, and I went down to the St. Lawrence River, and I had a drink. And it would be on the news everywhere. There's not near enough water coming out the end of the St. Lawrence River because Peter had a drink. No. But the point is that God gives us all these things, and He has no limit to them. It's not going to be that, well, Peter took the best ones and now there's nothing left for the rest of us. No, it's a river. It's a river. You can't drink too much from that river. Well, number 3, light and life. 9 and 10. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. Oh, continue your loving kindness to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright in heart. God is both the giver of light and life. You get darkness and death from Satan. God is the father of clarity and eternal life. Satan is the father of lies, and any that follow him end up in eternal death and darkness. They're so far apart that there's no way that there's no common ground between them. David was very grateful that he belonged to God because he experienced the love of God, and he knew well the darkness of evil. He fought against people who practiced abominable things. That was the darkness that he knew, and he was glad that he had God's love instead. Verse 10 is David pleading for loving kindness to continue, whatever it might look like, even if it was something that didn't look like kindness. I give you an example of kindness to Moses. Moses would say to God, I want to go into the promised land. And loving kindness was to say, no, you can't. And stop asking. I was listening to a woman who talked about how parents get a bad rap for being mean to their children. And he gave 3 examples. She said this woman was driving past the ocean, and the child the toddler wanted to go in the ocean and swim. And the mother said no. Well, that was quite mean, but the mother had a reason. It was less than 6 degrees in the ocean, and the child couldn't swim. There was a second case where the father denied his child the option of riding on the bus. The child was watching the bus and, I want to go for a ride. And the father said no. Now, it was a reasonable thing because the bus was on TV and it's hard to get the child through the screen. The third one was the child wanted to have batteries for breakfast. Don't even have to go there. We know. We see this as love, in spite of the fact that the children all had serious meltdowns over the meanness of the parent. It's the same way with God. He withholds something we want, and we mistake it for him being mean. But the truth is, it's love. He understands everything, and he knows how that one decision will affect those around us to the 10th generation. He knows all that will come from that decision, and we don't. And we're called to trust his judgment in the matter. So what's the conclusion? Well, David did a really good job using word pictures to point out how God's loving kindness was like. I hear worship songs and hymns that do the same thing. I stand amazed in the presence. I stand amazed at how wonderful and thought-provoking they are. We take off our hats to those poets like David and the songwriters who can describe what is, in essence, undescribable. You might be inclined to say, good for them, but what about me? I'm not the Gaithers. And poetry is not my thing. And there's another thing here too. They may have had some kind of wonderful encounter with God, which fuels the writing. We love those stories of old hymns where the man lost all his family they drowned at sea, and he wrote this wonderful hymn. Well, some of them may just be really good writers, and maybe that ability is a gift from God. We can be grateful for God for giving them that ability, like he gave it to David, who wrote half the Psalms. The Apostle Paul wrote about an experience he had when he was taken up to the third heaven and saw unspeakably wonderful things. And who wouldn't want that same thing to happen? Who wouldn't say, well, God, what about me? Paul said he was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him from becoming prideful, being the one to receive such an honor. Well, I for one would say, what a wonderful opportunity to have an experience like that of understanding God's loving kindness, what it's really like. We might say we missed out because we haven't had first-hand knowledge in the experience, and we have to rely on the accounts of others who had it. I remember reading a story, T.D. Bunn, as a writer, and he had a book called The Warning. It was a series, The Reluctant Prophet. And this prophet had a dream. It was a very vivid dream, and he remembered every detail. And it said, in 55 days, in 54 days, in 53, and over the course of 2 weeks, he understood what this dream meant. He understood that God was telling him that the world was going to go into a financial depression unlike any we'd experienced. And he had a message for his church. And so he was the prophet that was sent to these churches with a message. This is what you have to do. You have to buy this very, very risky stock maneuver, and you buy it on a certain day, and you sell everything you have so that you can buy as much as you can get, and you'll be rich. And I want you to do this so that you can look after yourself, but 50% of it will go to look after the church. And as he was saying this, he could look out into the audience, and all these people were having like that third heaven encounter that Paul had. And they knew for sure that this was a real thing. There was no doubt in their mind that they were ready to sell their car and sell their cottage and sell everything they had and put a mortgage on their house so that they could buy these stocks. And all this time, over the course of this month and a half, he asked God each time, Lord, give me this experience. And it was just silence from God. Ordinary men and women in the audience would get this experience, and he never got it. God never gave it to him. And it wasn't fair, but what could he do? Who could he go to complain to except to God, who already said no? The point I'm making with this story is some people will receive a special encounter with the Holy Spirit in the same way that some people will be miraculously healed. God doesn't promise everyone either one of these gifts, but we do have something. We have these stories. We have the story of Rahab and how that God sent 2 spies to her city, to her house, so that she could be saved and she would be in the lineage of Jesus. What a great story. We know God's loving kindness is real. We have these wonderful poems. We believe, we trust. That's the whole point of faith. Well, I didn't experience the third heaven thing, but I could read about it. And I know the scriptures tell me what kind of God is.